Good morning, sisters. It's wonderful to see you here. I'm so happy to be with you this morning. Early on in MWEG's existence, I was part of a gathering outside the ICE building in West Valley City to help with a woman who'd been ripped away from her family and detained. And I was asked to say a prayer at this event, and I was handed a bullhorn to say my prayer into. And I had to test it out first because, as I told them there, I knew that God could hear me, but I didn't know if they could. So right now I'm going to try to acclimate myself to this microphone. Is this better than if I talk back here? Okie dokie. Thank you. A quick perusal of retired Utah Supreme Court Justice Christine Durham's resume reveals many of her impressive professional accomplishments and awards. She retired from the Utah Supreme Court in 2017 after serving as a justice for 35 years and as Chief Justice and Chair of the Utah Judicial Council for 10 of those years. She received her AB with honors from Wellesley College and a JD from Duke University. Besides those impressive academic credentials, she has received honorary degrees from 5 Utah universities. Ms. Durham is past president of the Conference of Chief Justices of the United States. She is also past chair of the American Bar Association's Council on Legal Education and Admissions to the Bar, the entity that accredits American law schools. She is a fellow of the American Bar Foundation and served on the governing boards of the Appellate Judges Conference of the ABA's Commission on Women in the Profession, and is past president of the National Association of Women Judges. And the list goes on. If she had an MWEG lapel pin for each of her worthy accomplishments, she wouldn't be able to approach this podium because of the weight of all that metal. But her resume does not convey the whole of retired Justice Durham. Here are some details that help us understand the dynamic person behind the many accolades. Christine Meters Durham was born in August 1945. She is the oldest child of 3 and grew up primarily in Southern California. In 1960, her father became a U.S. Department of Treasury attaché at the Paris Embassy. She went with her family, attended French schools, and learned French. Her mother came from Mormon ancestry, but that branch of the family had decided, Ms. Durham recounts, that Utah was not the promised land and moved on to California in the 19th century. For the most part, they had left the church, so I was not aware that my mother had Mormon connections. I was apparently blessed in church and had some aunts and uncles who were active, but we didn't affiliate. When I was 7 or 8, Mormon missionaries knocked on the door, and my father, who was a friendly soul, invited them in. He went through apparently 3 or 4 sets of missionaries over 2 years and finally decided that he was going to convert to the Mormon church. It was at that point that my mother came back into the Mormon church, and I was actually baptized when I was 8. So I had both the experience of growing up knowing my nuclear family before church affiliation and after. She was almost always the only Mormon in her school setting. She says, "I honestly don't recall that being much of an issue. I just saw it as one manifestation of my identity akin to that of others. I was everywhere a member of a religious minority, but never felt isolated because of that. I know that this contributed to my need to think and act independently. I learned at a young age not to care too much about what other people thought about my choices. I felt no need to seek other people's approval about my beliefs." Young Christine was athletic. She loved sports and riding her bike. She was very good at basketball through high school. She liked riding the waves and hiking. Swimming was her greatest joy, next to reading. She also had interest in music, explaining, "I learned to read music when I took accordion lessons. We had a cute neighbor boy who played the accordion." She also learned group singing and how to play the piano. About her childhood, she says, "I was always a very good student, and I knew from a young age that I was smart. That was not always a good thing as a little girl. I wore glasses from the age of 2 and was sometimes called 4 Eyes, or the brain. I, of course, would have preferred to be cute and popular." About her mother, Miss Durham recalls this telling incident. When I was in middle school and my siblings were in grade school, we all were home one day, and at dinner, my mother looked around and said, "Well, does anybody notice anything different around here?" I said, "No, we can't tell." She said, "Well, that's good. I took a part-time job a while back, and I wondered if it was depriving anybody of anything." In musing on how her leadership skills developed, she says, "My childhood years were full of many opportunities to be self-sufficient and manage my own time. I was an oldest child, and my parents had alternating shifts until I was 11, so I had responsibilities for younger siblings. It was also a very safe time in Southern California, and I was allowed to roam far and wide on my bike and to read endlessly and uninterruptedly all summer long. I think that helped me to grow up independent and self-determined." When Miss Durham attended Wellesley College near Boston, an Ivy League women's college, and also my alma mater, her stake patriarch blessed her. In blessing her, he said she would be instrumental in teaching the people to be law-abiding. While a student at Wellesley during the 1960s, she witnessed the court's ability to impact change. She was deeply influenced by the work attorneys were doing in the civil rights movement. She was drawn to the law because of its dependence upon the use of language, persuasion, and nonviolence to accomplish change. As Emweg sisters, those four core values, faithful, nonpartisan, peaceful, and proactive, this resonates very deeply. Ms. Durham was only one of a few women studying law at that time. She was also married and gave birth to two of her children before completing law school. With her husband, George Durham, she said, "We had, for no apparent reason, the attitude that we could do anything we set our minds to." One thing they set their minds to, recalls Miss Durham's longtime friend Judy Dushku, was to cook a good-sized duck in the wee little oven in their teeny-tiny married student housing unit for Thanksgiving one year in Cambridge. When they pulled the cooked duck out of the oven, it too had shrunk to an itty-bitty size, enough for each of them to have a morsel. One other detail I learned is that Christine Durham enjoys British mysteries. Now, before she comes to the podium to deliver her keynote, I want to share with you the Deseret News editorial published at the time of her retirement. It reads, "The balance of life, work, family, and faith can be challenging for anyone. Add in institutional and cultural prejudices against a career choice, and the pressure might seem insurmountable to many. It takes a special type of confidence and ability to overcome those obstacles and succeed. Utah's long-serving state Supreme Court Justice Christine Durham has those qualities abundantly." Durham became an attorney at a time that was viewed primarily as a man's profession. Women, especially married women, were expected to point their lives in different directions. She faced hostility from some at Duke University for her career choice because some men saw her as taking a job from a man who might need it to support a family. She persevered, and after moving to Utah with her pediatrician husband, became the state's first female district court judge. Eventually, she became its chief justice. All along, Durham and her husband also were devoted parents to 5 children, providing for their needs and attending piano recitals and parent-teacher conferences like any other parents. They were active in their church. Durham has cited faith as one of the anchors that helped her maintain a balance. Durham is a trailblazer. She showed women they can accomplish through much hard work, a thick skin, and dogged determination. Much has changed in the culture since Durham studied law in the 1960s, but that change can be attributed in large part to people such as herself who would not be stopped from accomplishing great things. And now it is my privilege to turn the time to Christine Meters Durham. Thank you.
If you didn't know it before, now you know Wellesley women stick together. I'm delighted to be with you this morning, and I would like to congratulate the leadership and the staff of this organization for this amazing conference, the resources that have been gathered and put together for discussion, for learning, for advancing, for acquiring skills is truly impressive and wonderful, and I'm delighted to be a part of the work and the celebration. I would add just one thing to my sort of personal bio, which I often tell people, and anyone who needs it is free to adopt this motto, which became that of our families very early on when we were doing all the juggling, and that is, if there's a harder way to do it, we'll find it. And we did. I titled my remarks, "Women's Work is Never Done." And of course, you know the old adage, man may work from sun to sun, but women's work is never done. It's an adage that's often been used over the years to refer to the degree of personal, private, family work which women do, which is unacknowledged, unpaid, unappreciated, unvalued, not counted as part of the economy, even though it sustains the economy. So that's one way of thinking about women's work, and the fact that those acts of caregiving, of family sustenance, of keeping homes running, simply is never done. Do I need to do something with my mic?
Let's see. I wish it moved this way a little
Yes,
farther.
it's a long way away.
I think it's
If I lean a little bit, is
Yes,
that better?
perfect.
Okay, I'll just lean. I recently had knee replacement surgery, so that feels good anyway. But there's also another aspect of the idea of women's work, and that has to do with the notion of women's work in the public sphere. It was mentioned that I went to college and started law school in the 1960s, a period of enormous upheaval and change in American politics and American social life and American culture. And I was really part of the second big wave of American feminism. You know, I read Betty Friedan and Simone de Beauvoir and attended consciousness-raising groups, and I don't see too many people who look like they're my generation, so some of these may be foreign ideas to you, but I have to say one of the things that pleases me most about this gathering is all of the younger faces. The people who are picking up the torch. Because during the 60s and the 70s, when that wave of feminism was sweeping the nation, we thought we could fix things once and for all. We thought if we passed the Equal Rights Amendment, if we changed all the gender discriminatory laws, if we ensured that women got equal pay, if we ensured that women had equal political rights, usually as a matter of political structure and legal structure, changing the statutes, then the world would change for women. And there is a significant extent to which that has been true. At least we have, in this country, identified a number of things that we understand to be either constitutionally or statutorily guaranteed rights for equality in the public sphere for women. The reality on the ground, however, tells us, and I think my generation has been very aware of this for a number of years, that we didn't fix everything. That changing structure, changing laws was a first and necessary step, but that it was going to take much more than that to actually improve the quality of women's lives across the board. So we still deal with healthcare gaps, we still deal with income inequality, we still deal with an absence of equal pay for equal work. A huge percentage, for example, of Utah workers are not protected by any anti-discrimination provisions. People don't realize that because we've got federal law under Title VII, and we have a state anti-discrimination statute, but neither one of them applies to employers with less than 25 employees. How many small businesses in our state have fewer than 25 employees? And for those people, discrimination on the basis of race, sex, pregnancy, all kinds of issues are not redressable in the court system. So there are these big gaps between the way the laws were envisioned and the changes we thought they would bring about and what has actually happened on the ground. So when I talk about women's work, I certainly have in mind the typical focus retrospectively on the private work we do, but I also want to incorporate, and I think it's at the center of your work in this organization, the idea of women in the public sphere working to change the cultural, working to change norms, working to bring about a greater level of unity, peace, and equality in our society at large. It's a fantastic mission. One of the things I think you probably know, and if you've never had her come and speak to you, you should invite a woman named Valerie Hudson, who used to teach at BYU, now teaches at, I believe, Texas A&M, and she's an expert in national security issues, global national security issues. She's done a great deal of research, and I heard her speak a year or two ago on the theme of the fact that women's rights, adequate protection of the status of women and children and families is directly tied, based on her empirical research, to national security and peace. That nations which do a good job of preserving women's right to education, to vote, to political representation and activity, to health care, those nations have a much higher chance of achieving a peaceful society, which, you know, that's a real, isn't that an interesting question? I mean, one of the themes I've meant to sort of outline what I wanted to talk about today, but I'm going to come around in the end to talking about the fact that women's work has to stop being women's work. It has to become human, the work of humankind. And this empirical data on security and peace is only one small vestige of the enormous importance, reflection of the enormous importance that that work has. So I wanted to talk about the fact that women's work occurs both in private, in matters of family and faith and internal communities, but it also occurs in the context of public life, the degree to which women not only participate in the public life of their communities, but have a real voice in their communities. There's plenty of research that demonstrates that diversity in decision-making, in the process of decision-making, improves the quality of decision-making. Women grow up in many respects in different environments from men because of the cultural expectations that we still have that are tied to gender. And to have those perspectives and those voices engaged in the decision-making bodies matters a great deal. Now, sometimes we think about public life as what we read well, I was going to say the Washington Post or the New York Times, but I know you all are nonpartisan, so I'm sure there are other places you read these things where, I have to, let me say, I'll try to be very careful today, but as a judge, you are prohibited from ever engaging in any form of partisan activity. You don't go to fundraisers, you don't speak out on politics, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the things I have enjoyed about being retired is occasionally making a partisan remark. So I'll try to I'll try to avoid that today. But you know, we read and we're bombarded by the cable news and the press, what's left of it, the newspaper press, what's left of it, with a degree of drama. That's the kindest word I can think of, at the national level. And it actually has been very heartening to me to see the degree to which women are developing voices in that forum very recently and starting to get higher levels of representation. But the truth is, as most of us know, wherever we live in this country, that the real quality of life in a community depends far more on who's on the school board, the water commission, the county commission, the city commissions, and in particular the educational institutions and the state legislatures. And one of the things that I'm really hoping to see, well, I'm always hoping to see more bipartisanship in our state legislature, in our state, but I'm particularly hoping to see more women on the Republican side of the ledger in state politics, because their voices really matter. And I look back at numerous friends I've had over the years in the state legislature, many of them Republican women, who really did a lot of very good work. So to the extent you have opportunities today and I know some of you are already full-fledged activists and probably fully fledged participants in politics, local, state, and national. But if you're not, and even if you are, I urge you to take advantage of the discussions that are going to happen today that will improve your skills, give you ideas about how you can participate, and give you role models of how other people have worked out that work-life balance, as we call it, and add to that politics, family, and faith. And you've got, what's the five-fold counterpart of a trifecta? Anybody know? A lot of factors to factor in. But I also want to say, the second thing I want to talk about in this context of women's work in the public sphere is the question of faith and public life. There is no question, and your organization and its energy and its membership really are a testament to the fact that people's faith in a good way to live one's life, and people's faith in that teaches them the meaning of life and the purpose of life is and should be, in my view, the ultimate motivator to engage in the community and the public sphere. And you only need, I just took a brief glance through the Purple Book that MWEG has put out to find any number of allusions to that and comments about that I found very touching and meaningful. But there is an interesting road to walk when we rely on our individual faith and on the teachings of an institution which we love and belong to motivate our activity in the public sphere. And I was reminded of how fine that line is and how many people transgress and walk over that line. When I saw a news report, I think just last week or possibly the week before, of a speech that the Secretary of State of the United States of America gave. Now, he was speaking to a faith-based group, so perhaps he felt he had more leeway, but he remained the Secretary of the United States of America. And in his speech, he referred to the fact that we are a Christian nation and that the current administration of the United States of America was probably going to be responsible at God's direction for saving the Jews. I mean, I was so appalled and stunned. And, you know, I immediately thought of Muslim friends, even of some Jewish friends who might not want that particular savior, I don't know. And friends I have of no connection to organized religion, no particular. And in that one sentence, one of our most significant public officers lined them out of the American polity and claimed for his own particular religious view of the world a sanctity that he had no right to claim, that no one had been elected to fulfill. Now, I'm a lawyer, and I believe I'm pretty Jeffersonian on some points, and one of them is the wall between church and state, the wall between religion and public life. And so I think that each of us who is motivated by our beliefs about the way the world is and what humanity is for have to be even more respectful and careful when we engage in the public sphere, to be certain that we are not using our activism as merely a means of missionary work, of conversion, of propagating the notion that the nation would be a better place if indeed it were all of the same faith. We are not a homogeneous nation in terms of our religious commitments and beliefs. And so it's very interesting to think what that means, because we, of course, it's for people of faith, that is part of their identity, that is part of their motivation for public participation. But it's really important, it reminds me a little bit of the oath that judges, both state and federal, take when they enter into the judicial office. And that is to put aside, to the extent it's humanly possible, their own predilections, their own commitments, and to be faithful interpreters of the law and the Constitution. And it seems to me that when we undertake the work of public servants, or when we critique the work of public servants, or when we engage with public servants themselves, that we also recall that in the public sphere, our fealty and our loyalty to a significant extent has to belong to the guarantees of our laws and our Constitution, and not necessarily to the strictures of our own personal faith and religious lives. And I think that's a very difficult line to follow, but my own experience in living in different cultures, and as was mentioned, you know, I spent all of my youth in places where actually I think it's harder to be a Latter-day Saint in public life these days than it was 30 or 40 years ago. Nobody ever heard of Mormons in France, so or if they did, they just knew the missionaries with their name tags and so on. So you kind of got a blank slate, but I've noticed over the years that the first thing people want to know when they find out I'm from Utah is whether I'm a Latter-day Saint or not. They say Mormon, and they always will, by the way, but don't quote me on that. I will admit to once in a while, in certain settings, just doing some controlled experiences. Sometimes I'd say yes, and sometimes I'd say no, and see what kind of reaction I got from people. I don't recommend that experiment, but it was very educational. I learned a lot about people's perceptions and the stereotypes to which we are subject, just as we apply stereotypes to others. And by the way, that reminds me to go back just a minute to my earlier comments about the notion that I had when I was young and my generation had in the work of feminism, was that all we needed to do was change the rules and everything else would come along. And I went through a period of considerable disillusion and concern. And then I started coming across the research on implicit bias. Have you all encountered the concept of implicit bias? The notion that our decision-making capacities as human beings are kind of hardwired to rely on assumptions that we make. And you know, I've often thought that if you couldn't rely on certain assumptions, you couldn't get out of bed in the morning. If you had to go back and re-examine every single premise on which you were going to operate. But those assumptions can cause great difficulty in the context of civil rights, equal rights, particularly with respect to gender and race. There are many others. We have assumptions and stereotypes based on age, on appearance. I mean, one of the examples, I've done a lot of training in this area, especially for judges. Now, if you suggest to a judge that he or she is not as impartial and fair as they think because they have these implicit assumptions, sometimes they don't take it very well. It's not a comfortable, it's a little bit of a role conflict. But sometimes I'll start out with one statistic that I find just fascinating. Appearance bias is very prevalent in our society. And how many people do you think in the United States, how many men in the United States are over 6'4"? It's very small. It's about 3 to 4%. Now guess what percentage of CEOs of major American companies are over 6'4"? Well, it's not that high. It's closer to 20%. And if you go down below just over 6 feet, not over 6'4", it jumps to like 60%. And of course the population's larger too, but it's still only about 17%. So does that mean that if you're tall, you're smarter? I don't think so, but I think you look smarter. And you all know, I used to complain about being called Four Eyes, and then at some point in my life I read an article that said that people think people who wear glasses are smarter. That one only lasts about 30 seconds though. As soon as you open your mouth, they've got more information upon which to base assumptions. So we all make assumptions in our daily life. One of the ones that I contend with these days, and I see a few gray hairs in the audience, is ageism. My husband was just commenting on a piece he'd seen in the paper which talked about a 71-year-old who had been, I think, the victim of a crime or something. And he said, you know, it's really startling because when I hear 71-year-old's been a victim of crime, I think, oh, that poor old person. And then I stop and think and realize I'm older than that poor old person. And I don't really feel poor. So we all contend with expectations and assumptions. But I came to the conclusion that was at least one explanation for the difficulties that we have had in changing the culture in fundamental ways. So that's something else that I'd urge you to read about, think about. And you know, you see it. I remember the culture shock that I experienced in moving to Utah in the mid-1970s and living for the first time amongst a population with so many Latter-day Saints in it. And, you know, I told my husband after we'd been here a while, I said, this is bizarre. This is the first place I've ever lived where the first thing anybody wanted to know about you was, were you in the church or out of the church? And I had a lot of culture shock. I remember within, I think, a 2-week period, I went to a Relief Society program in my local ward where they did skits about evil bra-burning feminists. I'm going, well, I'm not interested in burning any bras, but I'm definitely a feminist. And then within 2 weeks of that, Gloria Steinem was invited out to a women's conference at the University of Utah, which I attended. And I was part of a small group discussion one evening where she had maybe 40 people sitting around asking her questions, or she was asking them questions, and a group of them undertook to explain to her the difficulties that they had in operating within the dominant culture. And their perspective of the dominant culture was not friendly. And I thought, oh, I'm going to have to move back to North Carolina or someplace. This is going to be a hard place to make my way. And ultimately, of course, you do find ways to make your way. And organizations like this support that effort and give you comfort and company and ideas and training. And the world's a much better place for all of those things. The implicit bias stuff has been around for a while now, 10, 15 years. And it still, it seems to me, has enormous hope for helping us to sort through the persistence of cultural problems in our society. Religious bias, appearance bias, race bias, sex bias. But I also have become, along with many scholars, a little bit concerned that it also doesn't appear to turn out to be a panacea, a magic pill. That the trick, it's one thing to help people understand that they have those expectations and assumptions. It's another thing to get them to live in such a way that they don't rely on them in their decision making. And that's hard. And you'd be surprised, have any of you ever taken the Harvard, it's called the Implicit Attitudinal test, the IATs that you can take online? They've developed a whole series of tests where you can examine your own tendency to associate different things with assumptions and biases. So I took the one on women and paid work. Now, I've worked since I was 17. I've considered myself to be a feminist all of my life. I thought, I'm going to ace this one. But what the test evaluated was the degree to which you were inclined to associate men with paid employment versus personal family work, or women with personal family work versus paid employment. And the results of that test, and frankly, I've never had the courage to go back and take the ones on race. I'm not sure I can stand it. But it came back suggesting that I was moderately biased in favor of associating women with family work, unpaid family work, and men with paid employment. And what that said to me was, I was a child in the 50s. I don't know how to explain it. I really don't. I will say that it made me much more careful about a lot of my decision making. When I was a judge, I hired new law clerks every year, and I started being very careful to ask myself if I was making assumptions about how the people who were interviewing with me and applied to me were going to spend their lives and what their priorities were, and to try to discourage any assumptions that I might make about that. And I think I got better at it, and that's the idea, that if you teach people what the issues are and give them some skills for tracking their own behavior, they can get better at it. So, going back to my point about faith and public life, we have the delicate task of incorporating our values, which come in such significant part from our religious faith, into efforts that will benefit people throughout our communities, not just people of our particular faith, and not just not people of our political faith, but that specifically they will be enriched and included and advanced and encouraged by virtue of everything we do, the sort of lifting all boats concept. The last thing I wanted to talk about, and I mentioned this, was the idea of women's work, and this applies to both the dimensions of women's work, the private sphere and the public sphere. We have got to find a way to redefine the notion of women's work, both privately and publicly. We have got to come to understand it as public work, as the work of every human member of the human community. And that's very, very difficult. I mourn the fact that we in the United States are the only highly industrialized nation in the world that has no public policy on families and children. We don't have universal paternity and maternity leave in instances of childbirth or children coming into families. And, if you want to talk about a public policy issue, I'm not sure if you're aware, there is a federal effort underway to develop and extend maternity leave, but they're planning to take the benefits that you get in maternity leave off of your Social Security when you retire. So the government is not supporting it. You are supporting it, and your family are supporting it in terms of future earnings and future independence. That's a pretty punitive attitude towards maternity leave, if you ask me. And I'm wondering where are the women's voices on that issue? because that's something that every one of us should care about. With what we know about early childhood development, and that's the other thing, the issue of child care is no adequate, good quality child care for parents who work, and by the way, the vast majority of parents in this country these days cannot subsist on a single income. So the notion that women can just stay home and do that unpaid private work easily is a snare and a delusion. You know, things have not changed. I noticed this with especially my female law clerks, although the male ones too, but you know, they came to me usually straight out of law school. They'd never experienced any educational discrimination or job discrimination. And they went and they'd listen to my stories sometimes, and I could see their eyes metaphorically rolling. But then they'd come back to me after 5 years or so and say, you know, I want to have a family, but my law firm makes no accommodation for maternity leave or for my ability to have time with my very young children and then to have a life that allows me to sleep at night. And that's an important one. All of you who have been mothers know that sleep, I think the federal and state governments should all guarantee 7 hours a night for every new parent. But, and they didn't have any more options. They might have had a little more money than I did in my era, but there's no criteria for good child care. We don't even have standards, state or federal, other than minimal licensure standards. We don't, as a nation, care about families and children and struggling parents. They're on their own. And those are public policy issues that I think are just as important as equal pay, and equal access to health care. And of course, you add race into these calculations, and it gets worse and worse. There's been a lot of research in health care recently, and one of the things that has been established empirically is that black women get the worst health care in the United States. They're at the bottom of the access pool. And generally, of course, we're not doing a great job on child care. We've dropped, or on maternity care, we've dropped to something like 27th in the world on maternal deaths. How can that be with our health care? How can it be that so many women are dying in childbirth? Well, I digress. So let me go back to my main point, which is that okay, that was my alarm. Yes. Oh, but it's snoozing. It's going to do it again. I hit the wrong button. I want to end by asserting that men belong behind and next to the women in their private and public lives. And I want to share with you a family treasure. This is a copy of a letter that my husband's grandfather, who was John A. Widtsoe, I think there's a building named for him here on this campus, became an apostle at a very young age, was a university president at 2 Utah universities. And his wife's mother was Susie Young Gates, the daughter of Brigham Young. She was called the 13th Apostle. She had an office building next to the prophets in the church office building downtown because they were such good friends. She was an extraordinary woman. And he wrote to her in 1899, "You may be sure that I've been proud and thankfully satisfied when I've heard from time to time of your noble work among your sisters for the purification, the bettering of mankind. The honor that has come to you is much and makes us all happy, but the spirit which urges you on to spend time, comfort, and thought in these matters, I hold as a gift from heaven above all. I believe that to be a Latter-day Saint without feeling an impulse to help the world is impossible." I'm afraid I know that it is impossible because I know some people in that category, but I agree with John Widtsoe that it should be. "And the individual mission which we have must be active, aggressive, and eager for success, not for the sake of success, but for the sake of glorifying that mission. Every member of this church woman or man, is as if standing on the housetops crying some soul-lifting message to the multitudes on the streets. If one of us does not feel that mission prompting, he or she must look closely at themselves, for they are stagnating. Our missions vary, as our gifts. You are using your gift nobly. If my appreciation will aid in the least, you have it. If it will still aid to keep up the courage which you need to possess to work, know that you have it to the full. If your strength is so great that it rises above the needs of sympathy, I give you still my appreciation. And then I wanted to read just the last paragraph of this letter. And they did have a remarkable relationship, those two individuals. And Suze's daughter, Leah, my husband's grandmother, was no slouch herself. She was one of the first trustees of this university at its founding. She founded a couple of academic departments, both here and at the University of Utah. She was also known as the mother of the Word of Wisdom, and I have a copy of the cookbook she wrote. She was very down on sugar, but she didn't mind cream and fat. So, but in this last paragraph, he writes to Suze, I'm interested in your work and admire you for it. I also admire Brother Gates, that was Suze's husband. Without his willingness, you could not do so much. So few men are willing to undergo a little personal inconvenience for their wives to do anything. The exceptions are loved so much the more. A man's life is not measured alone by what he accomplishes. More than that is what he enables others to do. Self must be forgotten in the life of the noble nature. So women's work, it isn't done. There's a long way to go, but we need to stop calling it women's work. We need to start calling it the work of communities, the work of human beings, and recruit everyone we can think of, including all of the men who should be taking responsibility along with us for getting the work done. Thank you very much. Is that good? Oh, okay.
Oh, yes. It is my honor now to present to Christine Durham our MWEG Woman of Valor Award. Thank you for using your gifts so nobly. Thank you.
Thank you so much for the award and the recognition. I'm pleased beyond words to be associated with the work of this organization.